Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're looking at a product that's kind of stolen my heart, which is a bit strange in a way because it's a pretty basic product, it's a budget product, but for some reason it just does everything right for me, even though it's got a few drawbacks. So I'm excited to share with you the Loxjie D30. Now I don't know if I'm saying that right, it could be Loxjie, Loxjie, I'm not sure, it's a Chinese product, so I don't know if there's some kind of phonetic translation going on. I'm going to call it the Loxjie D30. I apologize if I'm completely mangling that. I have no idea what the correct pronunciation is. What you need to know though is it's a $170 all-in-one unit with an AKM DAC chip, which takes everything for full DSD, all PCM formats, etc., and produces an output through both RCAs and also an inbuilt headphone amp. So it's an all-in-one, one-stop solution for a simple desktop system that even has Bluetooth capabilities. So I was interested to take a look at it. I hadn't heard of the brand before, and I'm excited to share it with you today. To briefly continue the introduction of the D30, it comes from a brand called Loxjie, as I mentioned, but they're a subsidiary of SMSL, who I believe are also connected to Topping. So it comes with that same sort of feel as the SMSL, Topping, and now Loxjie products. And that is that it's built around a good quality DAC chip. It has very, very good measurements based on what I've seen around the internet, and it's all about producing a budget, solid, and respectable all-in-one unit. I mentioned the price before is $170 for us Aussies. That means it's about 240 Australian dollars, which is still a really good price when you put it up next to standalone DACs like the D50S that I will compare this to later. As always, before I get too much into the sound quality of things, let's look at the features and functions of the D30 first. Starting on the front panel, it's very simple. We've got the LCD or OLED display here. I haven't checked to see what it is, but it's a nice clean display with a 6.3mm headphone output next to it and a volume knob that is also your menu control knob. So the only interface here, the only physical tactile interface you have on the unit itself is the volume knob. What that means is that there's no quick access to things like input or output switching. You also can't quickly access things like the dimmer controls, so everything has to be done through the remote control provided if you're not happy with the speed of interactions using the volume control. That to me is a drawback. I've said before in my other reviews, as a full desktop system user, I don't need remote controls because everything's in arm's reach. What that then means is a product like this is a little bit of a hassle because I have to click on the button, I have to scroll through the menu, find what I want, click on that option, and then change the setting. So there's multiple steps involved to get to what I need. That said, this little device has still won my heart, and I can't fully explain why, but I just really like it. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about the other features and functions that'll hopefully help you understand why it's captured my heart and why I think it's a really great little product. Before we take a deep dive into the menu and what features and functions the D30 does offer, let me switch it off, unplug it, and swing it around to the back to show you what else is going on. So on the back here, we've got a very straightforward setup. There's nothing surprising here. We've got power input, so this has its own internal power supply and therefore takes a full-size power cord. It then has your USB, your coaxial splitter for your optical, an antenna for Bluetooth, and a pair of RCA outputs for the sound. So it's everything that you would expect and nothing that you kind of wouldn't. There's no surprises here. At $170, it's got everything you could possibly need from a DAC / all-in-one. The only thing it doesn't have, of course, is any kind of input, so this is not going to be a headphone amplifier for other DACs. It's purely a DAC or an all-in-one if you choose to use the onboard headphone amplifier. So having seen the back of the device, let's swing back around to the front, and I'm going to talk to you about what really makes this tick, and that is all of the features and functions it has in the menu. Now obviously at $170, you're not going to expect something like the D30 here to come up against things like the RME ADI2, and it doesn't. It hasn't got the EQ functionalities, it hasn't got crossfeed, so some of those really high-end functions are missing. What it does allow you to do though is have a range of options to do things like change the color of the display, set an auto off mode so the LCD screen turns off and therefore in theory could reduce noise in the system when playback's going on. It will also allow you to choose from a whole range of different filters. I didn't count them, but I think off the top of my head there might be 7. And those filters do make a little bit of a difference. Like with all DACs of this nature, The filters are a very, very, very minor change in the sound quality. It doesn't completely change the character of the DAC, but you can get some slight adjustments to things like the sense of spatial cues in the music and the overall feel of whether it's a little bit smoother or a little bit sharper, but they're very, very, very small increments. So don't get too hung up on this having all sorts of different colorations. I'm yet to find a DAC that does that through filters alone, and indeed it probably shouldn't, because if the filters are making that much difference, then there's probably too much going on in there. And when I say that, I mean too much messing with the actual signal if it's going to make that much difference to the output. One of the key features of the D30 in the marketing materials is that it has a number of different output modes. So you've got a variable output if you want to use powered monitors. You've also got a fixed output if you're feeding this to an amplifier with its own volume control. And then there's direct DSD output. Now what direct DSD output does is it means that the volume control is removed from the circuit altogether when you're playing back DSD. The reason that's important is because a lot of DACs like this one will otherwise apply a little bit of gain to the DSD in order to bring it out at a similar volume to PCM playback. By going to direct DSD mode, the theory is that you're taking out every last little bit of processing you can to keep the signal as pure as possible. So the DAC would receive the signal, decode it from the digital into the analog, and spit it straight out. If you weren't in direct DSD mode, what that would be doing is taking the signal, decoding it to analog, somewhere in that process giving it, say, a 6 dB boost, and then putting it out. So that little bit of extra processing in theory could degrade the sound quality slightly, and that's why the option's included in there. Now, once again, a slight drawback here is that you have to go into the menu system to choose which of these modes you're using. That said, it's probably something you're only going to set up once based on however your system is set up, and then you'll leave it alone. Just to clarify, when you're using direct DSD mode, you'll still get a fixed output for all of your PCM content, so whether it's MP3, FLAC, WAV files, etc., they'll all still come through fine with a fixed output. It just means that direct DSD is also coming through with a fixed output, but won't be given any extra gain to match up with similar PCM files. I did some brief testing of direct DSD, and I did find that there was probably a slight improvement in clarity and the overall tonality of the tracks when using direct DSD for DSD files. I think it did improve DSD playback ever so slightly, but it's not a make or break kind of difference. It's one of those things that'll be nice to have if you're a DSD enthusiast, but not something really to worry about if you've just got a scattering of DSD in your collection. What's nice though is that if you do have some DSD, you can just switch it on and leave it that way if you're feeding this as a DAC only to a separate headphone amplifier. So by now you've probably got the sense that the D30 is a well-featured budget DAC with some nice options, some nice functionality. At this point, my biggest drawback with it was the clumsy menu system and the fact that the 6.3mm headphone jack doesn't mute the outputs. So instead you've got to go through this multi-press selection method if you want to use the volume control to change the output. If you're happy to use the remote control, which is a decent remote control, you can very quickly switch inputs and outputs there. So that does negate this issue for many people, but for me, I do prefer the hands-on controls. The remote control that I've been talking about gives you basic controls over things like the input, the output. It's got a button called EQ. That's actually for the filters that I mentioned earlier, so it doesn't make a huge difference to the sound quality. It'll let you switch the display on and off and let you change the volume or the level out, whether that's the variable outputs from the RCAs or you're using the headphone amplifier at the front. The D30 literature makes a big deal about the fact that it's got separate volume controls, and I think that's a relatively big deal. I don't think it's a game changer, but what it means is that you can have this set with one volume setting for the RCA outputs if you're using a variable control, and you can have a different setting for the headphones. Obviously what that means is that if you need a higher level output from the RCAs than you do from the front panel, then when you're switching between your different devices, you're not going to get shocked with a sudden change in volume, a really loud burst of volume. And of course, vice versa, if your headphones require a lot of juice and your active monitors don't, you can switch between loud headphone listening or headphone listening at higher volume because the headphones might need that, to then sending a low level output without having to think about it first and then go and change the volume before changing outputs. So again, they're nice little features to have, but none of that is what sold me on the D30. What sold me on it is just how simple it is and how great it sounds for the price. It's not a giant killer. It's not the best sounding product I've ever heard. And in fact, it sounds pretty much exactly as I would expect it to for the price, which is to say good, but not amazing. But I think just having everything in one location, it's simple, it's clean, I think it looks attractive, it's just really won me over. So let's now talk a bit about the sound before a couple of comparisons.
I know the reason why we chose to say goodbye, but I can't help my feelings. Right now, I can't deny you never left my mind, and now my heart is bleeding. Why did I have to break it up? Guess I was just a young girl living in a dream world. I thought that I'd be better off, but now I pay the price I do. I don't know how to forget you. I can't forget you. You're always on my mind. I do the things that I should do.
I described the sound from the D30, and this is using it through the headphone output, so using it as a pure standalone. Everything about it, it's just a good quality, solid little unit. It produces nice, clean, detailed sound that's not edgy or digital sounding. It's got a nice sense of detail, but it doesn't push anything in your face. The mid-range is nice and clear. It's got a nice sense of weight there, and it produces a decent sized soundstage. So all in all, it's a fairly non-chip sounding chip-based DAC. If you've watched any of my other recent reviews of various chip-based devices, what I've found is that many of them produce this slight edginess to the sound, and somehow the Loxjie engineers that designed the D30 have managed to pull that back a little bit. It does result in a sound that may come across to some people as a little tiny bit warmer, but I think in most ways that's a really good thing. It's not warm and thick, don't get me wrong on that one. It's just not as clean and sharp sounding, and the sharp bit's probably the key bit. It's not as sharp sounding as some of the other DACs I've tried in recent times. That leans the DAC more towards a natural, enjoyable musicality, and that word is obviously troublesome for some people, but what I mean is it just produces an engaging sound rather than focusing on pure detail in your face instead. The best way to put all this into context though is to break this down and look at the quality of the amp stage in here and the DAC stage in here separately to really understand what's going on and where the sound characteristics are coming from. To start with, I thought I'd begin with the DAC because that's where it all begins. What is the DAC sending out, whether it's through the RCAs or into the inbuilt headphone circuit? To see how the DAC performed in isolation, I connected up a pair of Burson Audio Fun amplifiers, both using OPA 627 op amps, so identical amplifiers, one of them being fed by the D30 here, the other one being fed by the Topping D50S, powered by the P50 power supply. So the D50 on its own is a $250 US or 350 Australian dollar DAC, and I'm putting it up against an all-in-one worth 170 US dollars. So we're talking about 80 US dollars difference between the all-in-one here in the D30 and the D50S. That's not taking into account the cost of the P50 power supply, because the D50 can come very close to the same sound quality with any old phone charger. So I'm just thinking of this as the D50 at its best, let's say with a phone charger, $250 odd, up against a $170 all-in-one. So straight away you can see that the D50 is more expensive and doesn't give you the ability to have the output of the headphone amplifier, and it also doesn't have things like the direct DSD. Also, I should clarify, I've kept the D50 in its stock setup with its stock op amp because I think that's the simplest way to do these comparisons, is looking at the retail version of the D50S, no modifications, against the retail version of the D30 because it doesn't have the option for modifications. For this test, I ran through a few tracks and I'm going to show them on screen here as I talk a bit more about the sound. What I noticed was that there's quite a different character from the D50S and the D30. My first impression was that the D50 had a slightly more open sound in the upper mid-range, so it just sounded like things were a little bit more textural. There was a little bit more clarity at first, I thought, so my initial impression was that the D50 was the better product. As I listened more though, what I was finding was the D30 provided a better sense of weight in each of the notes, Instruments had more flesh and bone to them rather than being just a 2D replica of the instrument. Interestingly as well, despite the D50 having that little bit of upper mid clarity, I found the D30 actually had better sparkle and brightness in a good way in the upper registers of treble. So it never got harsh, it never got sibilant or bright, but it just had a sense of sparkle to it that brought the music to life at each end of the spectrum. To give an example of what I mean here, listening to Hands Away by Interpol, I found that at around 2 minutes when there's those cymbal strikes, the cymbal strikes sounded so much more accurate from the D30 than they did from the D50S. And to me that's because the D30 has both a better sense of weight in the mid-range, which gives the body and the fullness and the harmonic richness to sounds, but it also has that better sense of extension in the treble, or maybe not extension, but the quality of the treble is better from the D30 in the upper registers. So all in all, it combines to make a more natural overall sound that I found myself consistently enjoying over and above the D50. What it also showed me is that a lot of the D30's character comes from the DAC stage itself. It's a really nicely implemented DAC stage, particularly at the $170 price point. The fact that you're then getting a headphone amplifier thrown in is really quite a bonus. And then of course leads me to the next question, which is, does the inbuilt headphone amplifier stack up and deliver the quality that you want to get the most out of a really nice DAC stage? So to test this out, I put the internal headphone stage of the D30 up against my favorite budget amplifier that I've ever heard at this point, which is the Topping L30. The Topping L30 is astounding, and so in many ways this is a tough gig for the D30's internal amp to match up to something as good as the L30, but I thought it was a good comparison. And if nothing else, it told me what the D30 could do if it was paired up with a great headphone amp. So we've got a $140 headphone amp up next to $170 all-in-one here. So you'd expect the L30 to perform better than the internal headphone amp in here, given that you're paying just $30 more for everything that's going on inside the D30 here. And definitely that's what I heard. The L30 was clearly and comfortably better than the inbuilt headphone amp. That's not to say the inbuilt headphone amp here is a disaster, but you can definitely get gains from using something like the L30 with the D30. Specifically what I heard, and I was using the track Fireworks by First Aid Kit, which was suggested by Astro Fantastica, what I heard was that the L30 produced better bass, it produced a better definition of sounds and better overall separation of the sound as well. So everything was just clearer, cleaner, and more separated to produce a better overall presentation. Things like cymbal hits had better resolution and overall realness, and the bass had better depth and punch. That was true with any headphone I tried, whether it was something like the DT880 250 ohms or the Hi-Fiman Sundaras. All of them performed better consistently on the L30 than they did on the inbuilt amp in the D30. The good news is I had no problems getting reasonable listening levels on either of those two headphones. So what that says to me is that the D30 is going to be up to the task for most of those sort of budget mid-tier headphone requirements. I don't have a difficult 300 ohm headphone here at the moment to try, and indeed I'd suggest that this is probably not a setup you'd buy to drive a really top-end demanding headphone like say an HD800. What it proved to me that it will do though is comfortably drive all of the wonderful mid-tier options that we have around us now, including things like the Hi-Fiman Sundaras, the DT880s that I mentioned, and it even worked beautifully with something like the Focal Clear. So anything that's not at the extremes of either very, very low impedance or very, very high impedance, you should be pretty comfortable with. Speaking of low impedance, I did try the D30 inbuilt headphone amp with IEMs. I was using the Noble K10s and I found no problems with the output. I have seen on another website there was talk of the fact that there might be a bit of noise floor for extremely sensitive IEMs, so maybe something like the Campfire Andromedas would have problems and other similar IEMs, but with something like the K10, which does often reveal hiss, I had no problems at all. So you could use this quite comfortably for the majority of IEMs on the market, and the fact that it's got a digital volume control means you get perfect channel balance throughout the range. So all in all, I think the D30 is a fantastic brilliant little budget setup. If you only want one box on your desk and you want it to do everything you can think of, this is pretty much the product to go for based on what I've heard so far. Admittedly, I haven't reviewed a lot of all-in-ones, so there are other options out there from Topping as an example and SMSL that I haven't tried and therefore can't compare to, but I am certainly very taken with the Loxjie D30. It's got its flaws, the menu system's a little bit fiddly and a bit cumbersome if you don't want to use the remote control, but I think overall it's just a really good offering because it manages to bring together a very natural and organic kind of sound at a really good price point and has the ability to perform at an even higher level if you want to use it as a DAC only and send to a higher quality headphone amp. Certainly for me, something like the D30 paired up with the Topping L30 could make for a really fantastic entry-level system. Unfortunately, I don't still have the Topping E30 here for a comparison because to me that's currently going to be the question. Does an E30 and L30 combo beat the D30 from Loxjie combined with the L30? Putting that aside though, I do think this is a great standalone product. I'd highly recommend it to anybody in that sub $200 US range as an all-in-one that's going to do pretty much everything I think you could ever ask it to do. If that's something you're interested in, I'll put a link down below to the store that you can buy this from. I've only seen it at one location so far, which is Hi-Fi Express, so that's the link I'll put down there. There's no affiliate kickbacks or anything. This is just a review of a great product that I think is worth recommending. As always, if you found this video helpful, hit the like button and the subscribe button. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.